They said the land under Magnolia Hall breathed. On still nights when the wind refused to move and the magnolia blossoms hung heavy with scent, you could hear something shifting beneath the roots, soft, wet, and alive. In the spring of 1841, the estate belonged to Eleanor Calhoun, a young widow whose husband had died only months prior. Some said fever took him. Others whispered of poison. She was beautiful, pale as milk, with a stillness that made people uneasy. The townsfolk said she never cried, never laughed, only walked the plantation halls barefoot at night as though the boards whispered back to her. Her servants feared her silence. They said she spoke to no one, yet the candles in her room burned till dawn, flickering like breath. Then one night she made an announcement. Her best slave would be rewarded for his loyalty. His name was Samuel, a quiet man with eyes too old for his age. When the rain began that evening, the other slaves saw her standing outside the quarters, white dress clinging to her skin. She called Samuel's name softly and led him back to the manor. He did not return by morning. His bed was untouched. The dogs howled until their throats bled, digging near the magnolia trees. By noon, the earth had turned dark with moisture, and something thick and red pooled in the rainwater. That night the house went silent, and Eleanor smiled for the first time. The next day, Eleanor emerged from her chamber wearing a crimson shawl no one had ever seen before. Its fabric shimmered damp at the edges, as if it had been dipped in blood. She moved through the halls with slow grace, her voice calm, her eyes distant. Samuel's name was erased from the records that week. When the overseer asked why, she replied that he had been set free. Yet the others whispered that his voice could still be heard behind the walls when the house was quiet. A sickness spread soon after. The cotton blackened in the fields. The air grew heavy with the smell of rot, and the birds began to die mid-flight. Eleanor said it was the season, that decay was natural, but even the preacher refused to come for Sunday blessing. He said he had seen a shadow behind her when she spoke, a tall, human-shaped figure with no face. At night, the servants heard her murmuring softly to something in her room. They said she used Samuel's name like a prayer or a curse. One maid claimed to have seen him walking near the tree line, naked and trembling. Eyes rolled white, his lips moving soundlessly. Eleanor dismissed it all as gossip, but she had the same dream each night, Samuel kneeling beside her bed, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. And when she woke, her sheets were damp, her body ached, and the air smelled of iron. Eleanor locked herself inside the east wing soon after. She claimed it was for mourning, but everyone knew she was hiding something. Inside that wing stood a mirror her late husband had imported from Europe, its frame carved from dark oak, its glass faintly rippling as if holding a current beneath its surface. The servants feared it. They said it hummed at night, like a low voice trying to remember words. The first girl who tried to clean the east wing saw a man's face in the reflection behind her own. When she turned, no one was there. The next morning, her tongue had swollen black and she could not speak again. Eleanor dismissed her. "The fever comes for the weak," she said. But that evening she was found kneeling before the mirror, whispering Samuel's name, clawing at her reflection until her hands bled. She told the housekeeper that Samuel was not dead, that he lived in the glass and that he wanted her to join him. The overseer sealed the east wing, but each night afterward, the knocking began. Slow, rhythmic, almost polite. When the wind blew from the east, the sound deepened into a moan. Some said it was grief. Others swore it was two voices, one weeping, one laughing, entwined in endless prayer, and still the mirror waited, covered in dust, reflecting no one at all, like autumn. Magnolia Hall had turned into a mausoleum of silence. The workers spoke in whispers. The fields lay rotting, and the church refused to bless the estate. But every Sunday, Eleanor could be heard reciting psalms alone in her parlor, the same one her husband once used for sermons before his death. yet what she recited was not what the good book held. Her voice trembled through the walls, repeating words that did not exist in Scripture. The servants called it the 13th Psalm, a prayer for the dead who could not rest. At night, the melody of her voice twisted into something inhuman, the rhythm uneven, as if someone else whispered between her breaths. A small boy, one of the errand runners, swore he saw her mouth closed while the prayer still continued. The next morning, that boy was found in the stables, eyes wide open, straw clutched in his hands, whispering her psalm to the horses. They shot the animals when they began to scream without making a sound. Eleanor said it was madness that ran in their blood, a fever of the mind. Yet her own hands trembled when she poured tea. She began to wear gloves, claiming the air stung her skin. Beneath the lace her fingers had grown dark, almost gray, and something pulsed faintly beneath the surface, as if her blood no longer obeyed her heart. Still she prayed, always to the same presence, always to Samuel. The overseer, James Alcott, began keeping a ledger, a secret diary written in pencil between cotton tallies and supply lists. He recorded strange sounds from the main house, scratching from the walls, the chiming of bells at odd hours, the rustling of skirts when no one walked. He wrote that Eleanor had taken to sitting by the east wing door for hours, humming lullabies meant for children long dead. Sometimes she laughed, sometimes she spoke to someone behind the wood. Once he heard a man's voice answer her, low and wet like breathing through water. When he confronted her, Eleanor smiled faintly. "There is no death, Mr. Alcott," she said. "Only the dead of flesh. Samuel understands this now." That same week, Alcott's wife fell ill. She claimed to see a shadow crouched at the foot of her bed every night, tall, faceless, swaying like a pendulum. He fled the plantation 3 nights later, leaving behind his ledger. The last entry was written in shaking lines. "The magnolias bleed in the rain. The roots whisper names. She feeds the house with her dreams. They found his horse wandering the woods at dawn. Reins torn, saddle empty. After his departure, Eleanor dismissed the remaining overseers and took full control of the land. But at night she was no longer seen alone. Footprints, larger than hers, appeared in the mud outside her chamber window, always leading in, never out. Winter came early that year, harsh and unrelenting. The fields froze under gray skies, and the hall's chimneys belched black smoke for days. The servants whispered that the widow was preparing a feast. She ordered barrels of salt, wine, and meat, though no guests were ever seen arriving. When the night came, she dined alone in the grand hall. The table was set for 2. Candles flickered against mirrors she had uncovered for the occasion. She raised a glass to the empty chair opposite her and said softly, "To my beloved servant, to the one who stayed." By morning, the dishes were gone, the fire cold, and the servants who ventured inside found the floor smeared with ash, thick, oily, still warm. The plates were licked clean. The chair opposite hers was broken in half. That night, Eleanor appeared at the balcony, her skin pale and stretched, her eyes sunken. She whispered to the wind, "He has returned to me." The following day, the fields bloomed again, unnaturally lush despite the frost. Cotton buds the size of hearts glistening red at their core. When cut open, they bled. The housekeeper fainted at the sight. The others fled into the woods, leaving the widow alone with her miracle. Magnolia Hall stood alive once more, breathing, pulsing, dreaming, and beneath its roots, something began to move again. Eleanor began to move through the house like a ghost, speaking rarely, eating less, and sleeping almost never. Her beauty had turned brittle, like porcelain left too long in frost. The servants who remained said she spent hours in the portrait room, where generations of Calhouns stared from their gilded frames, stern, powdered, and lifeless. She claimed to hear whispers in the paint. That the eyes of her ancestors moved when she prayed. She would sit in the candlelight and talk to them softly, telling them that she had freed Samuel from his chains, that he now lived within her house, her blood, her dreams. One evening, lightning struck the magnolia outside the window, and for a brief moment, the portraits flickered, their faces twisted, mouths open as if caught in a silent scream. The maid who saw it ran, but Eleanor called her back, smiling gently. "Don't be afraid," she said. "They only envy me." Later that night, the maid vanished. In her place, a new painting appeared, still drying, the oil glistening like sweat. The face in the frame was hers, eyes wide, lips cracked and bleeding. No one spoke of it again, but the smell of turpentine lingered through the halls for days, mixed with something sweet and metallic. Eleanor began signing her name on the backs of the portraits. Beneath her husband's, she wrote only one line: "The living must learn their place among the kept." The next storm that passed over Magnolia Hall was said to carry voices in the thunder. Some claimed they were names. Others said they were confessions. The cellar of Magnolia Hall had always been sealed, a relic from the original construction, filled with brine jars and broken barrels. But as winter deepened, a strange odor began to rise from the ground, sweet, rotting, alive. One morning, Eleanor ordered the cellar door unbarred. The men refused. She dismissed them and carried the lantern herself. What she found below was never written down, but when she came back, her white gown was soaked from the knees down, and her hair clung to her face like seaweed. From that night on, she was not alone. The servants heard footsteps at odd hours, small, uneven, dragging slightly. Once a kitchen girl swore she saw a figure by the stairs, a child's body, too thin, its skin gray as clay, its eyes wide and blind. It whispered her name, but the voice was Samuel's. When the girl screamed, Eleanor appeared, calm and smiling. "He wanted a vessel," she said, "and I gave him one." The next morning the girl was gone. Eleanor took to holding a small hand as she walked the halls. No one else could see it, but the shadows always stretched longer when she passed. At night, a lullaby drifted through the manor, half song, half prayer, and beneath the floorboards faint knocking began again, in the rhythm of a heartbeat. They said the child in the cellar never grew, never aged. It only waited for something or someone to open the door again. By 1842, word of Magnolia Hall's decay had spread far beyond Lowndes County. Travelers avoided the road leading past the estate. Livestock refused to graze near the fence line. Children claimed to hear a woman humming in the fields at night. The town's preacher declared the plantation cursed. He claimed that Eleanor had entered a pact with the dead of the soil. When he and a group of men rode out to confront her, they found the gates wide open and the air thick with the smell of magnolia and meat. Inside, the hall was empty. No voices, no footsteps, only portraits on every wall, hundreds of them. Faces twisted, eyes following. The dining room table was still set for two, and at its center stood a bowl filled not with fruit, but with what looked like beating hearts carved from red cotton. The preacher fell to his knees. One of the men touched a portrait. His own reflection blinked back. He shot the painting, but the bullet ricocheted, lodging in his chest. When they fled, the preacher looked back once and saw Eleanor at the top of the stairs, smiling faintly, holding a child by the hand. Both of them watched as the men rode away, the air behind them alive with whispers. Within the month, crops failed across the county. Wells turned sour, and those who had entered the hall that night began to dream of roots growing through their bodies, binding them to the earth. The town stopped speaking her name, but the magnolias never stopped blooming. Even in frost, they bled white petals and red sap. There was a well behind Magnolia Hall, old, half-collapsed, hidden beneath vines. It hadn't been used since before Eleanor's marriage. But that spring, travelers noticed a strange shimmer at its surface, as though moonlight moved beneath even when the sky was dark. One night, A hunter camped nearby claimed to see someone standing at the edge of the well. A woman in a torn dress, her hair long and black, her reflection perfectly still even as she moved. When she turned to face him, her reflection did not follow. It stayed staring into the depths. The hunter left before sunrise, and by morning his horse was found wandering near the fence, its eyes gone, its mouth filled with magnolia petals. The next week, children from the town dared one another to look into the well. None would go near after the first boy leaned over and saw two faces, his own, and another grinning from behind him. He swore he felt breath on his neck, though the air was still. That same night, the water in the well turned black, and something began to rise. Not water, not oil, but a thick, pulsing fluid that carried the scent of blood and salt. When it overflowed, the ground drank it greedily. The magnolias grew taller, their roots spreading toward the house, and beneath the windows of Magnolia Hall, new flowers began to bloom, each shaped like a human hand reaching upward. Eleanor stood at the balcony again, silent, her eyes hollow, her lips moving without sound. The reflection in the well whispered back. Spring returned, but nothing grew right. The birds sang off-key, and the wind over the cane fields carried a low hum like the breath of 100 unseen throats. The people who had once worked the land were long gone, yet at dusk, voices could be heard rising from the rows, slow, mournful, and wordless. Eleanor began attending what she called her evening services. She dressed in black, lit a dozen candles, and stood by the veranda overlooking the fields. Those who dared to watch from afar saw figures moving between the stalks, shapes that swayed and bent, some crawling, some upright. They moved to her rhythm, halting when her voice fell silent. One night, lightning struck near the old slave chapel and set it ablaze. The flames rose high, lighting the fields in a terrible orange glow. Witnesses said Eleanor did not run. She walked into the burning chapel, arms raised, her shadow merging with the fire. When the flames died by morning, the chapel's walls still stood, charred and weeping sap like blood. Inside there were no bones, only piles of ash shaped like kneeling bodies. The air smelled of candle wax and iron. That same night the church bell rang in town, though no one had pulled its rope. The sound was hollow, almost human, a deep wail that carried for miles. The next day, Magnolia Hall's windows were blackened from within, and every portrait's face had turned toward the east, as if waiting for something to rise. A month after the fire, a courier from Montgomery delivered a sealed letter addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Calhoun, of the house by the river. The paper was brittle, written in a hand unfamiliar to anyone alive. The date on the envelope read March 3rd, 1811, 30 years before she was born. She opened it in the dining room. The servant said she wept as she read, then laughed until her voice cracked. The letter spoke of the land's first owner, a man who had purchased Magnolia Hill from a preacher fleeing the coast. He warned that the soil beneath was cursed, that a voice sleeps in its roots and demands companionship. Eleanor folded the letter and placed it inside the family Bible, between the pages of Revelation. Then she whispered, "He has written to me again." The handwriting in the letter began to appear elsewhere. In her journals, on the walls of her chamber, carved into the wood of her bed. It spelled a single phrase, "The promise remains." She stopped eating. She stopped answering when spoken to. The servants left one by one, until only the housekeeper remained, old, blind, and too frightened to flee. She said she could hear Eleanor whispering in two voices, one human, one ancient. When the housekeeper finally ran, she looked back once to see Eleanor standing at the window, her hands pressed against the glass. The words, "The promise remains," had been written across the panes in blood. And beneath it, another line appeared as the moon rose. "It is your turn." Weeks later, travelers passing the estate saw someone working in the fields, a man-shaped figure moving slowly through the rows of red cotton. They thought it a scarecrow until it turned its head and watched them pass. When a group of curious men returned at dawn, they found the figure in the barn. It was made of wax, tall and pale, wearing Samuel's old clothes. Its face was featureless except for 2 deep impressions where eyes should have been. But when touched, the wax was warm. The men fled, but one looked back. He swore he saw the figure's mouth open slightly, forming a single word: Eleanor. That night, the house glowed faintly from within. Through the broken windows, the wax figure could be seen seated at the dining table. Opposite him sat Eleanor, silent, unmoving. She raised her glass in a toast to nothing. By morning, the wax had melted into a pool on the floor, but the chair across from hers was still indented, as if something heavy had been sitting there. The next rainstorm washed a pale residue from the windows, leaving streaks that resembled faces pressed against the glass. When a priest was finally summoned from Selma, he refused to enter the property. He said the air around the house was alive, breathing in and out like a sleeping beast. Inside the hall, the portraits began to weep. Not oil, not turpentine, but a thin, milky wax. The Alabama River ran behind Magnolia Hall, its current slow and brown like old blood. For years it had carried driftwood, fish, and the occasional carcass of a drowned animal. But one morning it carried something different: teeth. Hundreds of them, small and white, washing up on the banks. Some human, some not. The local fishermen found them tangled in their nets, clicking softly as the boats rocked. When word reached the nearby town, the sheriff rode out to the plantation, but he never crossed the gate. He said the air smelled of rain and rot and something else, something like perfume. From the riverbank he saw Eleanor kneeling in the shallows, her dress floating around her, her hands buried in the mud. She was humming softly, rocking back and forth. When he called to her, she lifted her head. Her mouth was full of teeth, too many, layered like scales, glistening in the light. He rode back to town without a word and never spoke of it again. A week later, the river turned red. Fish floated belly up. The magnolias bloomed twice that year, their roots thick as ropes reaching toward the water. By then, Magnolia Hall had become more than a house. It had become a mouth, feeding and breathing and remembering. And Eleanor, the widow who had once sought comfort in flesh, had become its tongue. The river no longer whispered her name. It carried it. When the moon was high, travelers on the Selma Road said they saw a light moving through the trees, a single lantern swinging gently. Sometimes it appeared near the river, sometimes by the gate of Magnolia Hall. Always alone. Those who saw it up close claimed it wasn't held by a hand at all, but floated, steady, at chest height. Behind it walked a tall figure, half in shadow, half in smoke, its body shifting like fog caught in wind. The light would pause, turn toward them, and the shape would tilt its head, as if studying its prey. Then it would vanish. Locals called it the Lantern Man, believing it was Samuel's spirit, condemned to wander between the house and the grave he never had. But others said the lantern was a lure, a trick of Eleanor's making, meant to draw the curious to her door. One night, 2 young men followed the light. Only one returned. He was found kneeling on the road at dawn, eyes wide, whispering. She asked if I wanted to see him. When they searched the woods, they found no footprints, only melted wax in the shape of bare feet. The next evening, the lantern appeared again, this time from the second-floor balcony of Magnolia Hall, and behind it, the widow smiled through the glass. After the Lantern Man began to appear, Magnolia Hall changed again. Doors opened to places that shouldn't exist, rooms that were never built, staircases that led to walls. Those who entered said the air inside those rooms was heavy, thick, and somehow wrong, as if sound refused to echo there. One of the few servants who remained, a man named Elias, claimed to have discovered a new door behind the library shelves. It opened to a narrow corridor lined with mirrors on both sides, stretching far longer than the house itself. He swore that in every reflection he stood alone, until he reached the end. There his reflection smiled, though he hadn't. Elias ran. The next morning he was found in the hallway, his eyes gone and his mouth sewn shut with threads made of hair. The new door was gone. The shelves had returned to their place untouched, except for a single line etched into the wood. The hollow must be filled. Eleanor began speaking of a place beneath the house, a chamber that sings in the dark. She told no one how she found it, only that Samuel waited there, patient and kind. At night she dragged furniture across the floors, moving rugs, tearing at the boards. The sound of hammering echoed for days, then silence. And when silence came, the walls began to breathe again. The entrance to the chamber was discovered years later, long after the widow had vanished. It lay beneath the parlor, hidden under warped planks and a single magnolia root that pierced through the floor like a finger. The stairway below descended into blackness, the air thick with the scent of salt and rot. Those who dared descend found the walls slick and pulsing, alive with faint movement, as if the wood had turned to muscle. At the bottom a pool shimmered, not of water, but something viscous red reflecting no light. On the far wall was a mural painted in what could only be blood, Eleanor kneeling before a faceless man, her arms outstretched, her mouth open as if in worship. Around them grew vines of magnolia, their petals shaped like eyes. The explorers said the pool rippled as they spoke, though no wind stirred. One of them reached to touch it and screamed before his hand broke the surface. He said something cold gripped him, something human. When they climbed back out, their hair had turned white and their skin bore marks like fingerprints. The chamber was sealed again, but the house never stopped making noise. Even now, when rain falls on the old land, water pools over that buried floor, and if you listen closely, you can hear voices rising with the storm, whispering her name. In 1846, 5 years after her disappearance, Magnolia Hall was found inhabited again. A traveler claimed to have seen a woman standing on the veranda at dusk, pale, barefoot, her dress in tatters. He said she called out to him, her voice soft, like honey over poison, "Come see what love has built." When he approached, she vanished, leaving only footprints on the steps and the faint scent of magnolia and smoke. Within weeks, others saw her too, wandering the halls, carrying a lantern, whispering to someone unseen. Some said she looked younger, untouched by age. Others swore she had no eyes at all. Her presence brought strange signs. The ground trembled, though no storm passed. The air grew warm even in winter. And in the fields the cotton turned black, bursting with seeds shaped like human teeth. A preacher, brave or foolish, entered the house with a cross and a Bible. He was never seen again, but his horse returned the next day with pages stuffed in its mouth, all from Revelation. The ink had been burned away. The widow of Magnolia was no longer human. She had become the voice beneath the roots, the promise fulfilled. By the end of the decade, Magnolia Hall stood abandoned. The windows were boarded, the doors nailed shut, but travelers still saw light moving inside. Pale, rhythmic, almost like breathing. The magnolia trees had grown enormous, their branches curling into the house itself, fusing with the brick and wood until it was impossible to tell where the living ended and the dead began. One night, during a lunar eclipse, a group of farmers camped near the estate. They swore the moon disappeared earlier than it should have, swallowed by a shadow that began at the plantation and spread across the sky. The air turned red, and from the direction of the house came the sound of singing, not words but deep guttural tones that shook the ground. When the light returned, Magnolia Hall was gone. In its place was a crater filled with black water and petals, hundreds of magnolias floating like corpses. The next morning, those petals had turned to ash, and the earth beneath them pulsed faintly as if breathing. For years after, nothing grew there. Not grass, not weeds, only silence. Time buried the story of Eleanor Calhoun. The records burned in courthouse fires. The land was sold, rebuilt, renamed, yet no one stayed long. Animals refused to graze there. Babies cried when carried past the magnolia grove that had once surrounded her house. In 1910, a new family tried to build over the ruins. When they dug for a foundation, they uncovered roots so thick and white they shone like bone. From their tips dripped a clear fluid that smelled faintly of iron and roses. That night, the youngest daughter woke to find the walls of her room pulsing, the floor warm beneath her feet. A voice whispered from the soil beneath the house, soft, maternal, familiar, "You've come home." By dawn, the family was gone. The house stood half-built, empty, silent, its frame wrapped in creeping magnolia vines. Locals say if you walk past on a humid night, you can still smell her perfume, hear the faint echo of her prayer, the 13th Psalm, rising from the ground. The flesh returns to the root feeds the soil remembers the promise. And if you kneel and press your ear to the earth, you'll hear the heartbeat of Magnolia Hall still thrumming, faint and wet beneath the ground, because the widow never left. She only learned to bloom.